Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to talk to you about what my research on our brains and the psychology of human beings has revealed about creativity, why it's important, and why it matters. So the first thing I want to show you, sorry the slides aren't looking great, but is that creativity is really a brain-resistant capacity of the human mind. Yeah? We know this from looking at people with certain types of brain injury, either caused through trauma or stroke and so on. And as we've seen that it's very difficult to break creativity. So if you look at case studies of artists who've gone through different types of neurological disorders, it's very rare to find cases where they don't continue to be creative in some capacity. Their styles might change, their mediums might change, their level of productivity might change. They might be slightly less productive, but they're still productive. Yeah? This is astonishing because it's very easy to break other functions, language, motor function, and so on. It speaks to the deep-seated nature of creativity and how it develops in our brains, in our bodies, in our minds. We see it apparent from the first time a child can express itself in some way, when it explores its environment, reaches out, plays, and so on. That's where it starts, and that's why it's encoded so deeply in our brains, okay? I want us to think about why this is. Why can't you break creativity? So I'm just going to give you an example of why creativity is a little bit different from other types of complex cognition that we do. So imagine how your mind works when you're trying to read a poem from a book, or you're trying to recite a poem from memory, compared to trying to create a poem from scratch. And if I ask you to do it today, you have some approach that you start with, and what you end with will be a little bit different from what you do tomorrow, or a week from now, and so on. And the reason why you do it differently each time, compared to reading a poem or trying to recite something from memory, is because of the plurality of the brain, the multiple realizability of the brain. Decades of neuroscientific research has shown us that there is no single brain region, no single brain network, and no single neural activity pattern that is exclusively in place for creativity. And that's a positive thing, yeah? What's there is that we just have our minds, our capacities, our bodies, and in situations where we're asked to be creative, it's the context that forces us to do something new, yeah? And so we use the brain that we have, which has evolved for all sorts of functions. We know a lot about the many, many, many brain networks that are in place. Networks are essentially specialized areas that work together in tandem for specific functions. And we know that of many networks now that are in place for specific functions. Yeah? And all these networks have in common is that they're built for a purpose. They're there to receive, and they're there to respond, yeah? And make sense of the world. So they receive information, they make sense so that we're better at recognizing, better at responding. So for those of you who were here yesterday, you should be readily able to recognize this, yeah? So yes, I've changed your minds forever. And for those of you who can't, perhaps you can try and see what you're seeing in this picture. It's hard to tell because it's a degraded image. When I show you a photograph, you should see a cute little frog staring right at you. Now if I show you the degraded picture again, you should be able to recognize the frog, and your brains have been changed too, because at any other time you see this picture, you will be able to see the frog. And that's because that's the way the brain works. Receptive predictive cycles. Take in information, make sense of it, store it for later use, to come up with the most plausible, most accurate explanation possible. So these predictive receptive loops are used all the time. Imagine the last time you were driving a car. For those of you who do drive, there are moments where you have to be really focused at an intersection. When someone brakes in front of you or runs across the road, you have your executive function network on hand, really focusing, really making sure you do planned action. Other times when you're driving, you really don't know how you got to some space because your mind wandered. Even such a really complex task like driving becomes fully automatized in many, many ways so that your mind is free to go somewhere else, yeah? Internal mentation. So this is kind of how the networks work. When it's needed in a way, it responds as appropriate. So it's a beautiful brain that we have that essentially is there, all these networks are there, follow the path of least resistance. They're there for a function, they're there to do a function as coherently, as accurately, as effectively as possible. The problem, of course, in the case of creativity is that these same mechanisms have to be used for another kind of loop, a generative-explorative loop, okay? So what happens there is that you have to actually overcome this path of least resistance. You have to break away from it. And what we do, essentially, when we're trying to be creative, is that we throw all our capacities at it. They all involved in a very dynamic way with one another, each of the networks that we have. There's a lot of evidence for all of these 4 networks to be involved in creativity, but we know that there are plenty more. Yeah? The attentional networks, the motor networks, all of them are also part of this. So, what I can say about the creative brain is that it involves about creativity and how it's instantiated in the brain is that it involves the multiple dynamic engagement of all of our brain systems that not only differ in the way it's dynamically engaged between us, like no two of us are doing it in exactly the same way, but also within you, okay? The way you use it today to do something creative will not be the same exact way as you'd use it tomorrow. And that's wonderful. That's the multiple realizability of the brain capacity there. That's why if one of these roads are blocked, you could use the other roads available. There are many roads to Rome. That's the first conclusion I want us all to be aware of. The second thing I want us all to be aware of is the doing. That seems to be the most important aspect of being creative, to do, which is why I picked those pictures to start the talk with. In each of these cases, we are doing, as designers, you know how much the act of engagement is important to your creative process. And there are many things that we've automated that are useful to automate because they take us away from wasting a lot of time on things that might be perhaps purely mechanical. I'm really glad we have washing machines and I don't need to wash all my clothes by hand anymore, right? But not all automation is equivalent. There's times in which it might be useful to outsource some mechanical aspects of it, but we perhaps have to pay attention to when we start to outsource the cognitive elements of our ideation process. We are in a phase now where a kind of de-evolution is being spoken of because we've entered a phase where a new kind of automation has entered our landscape, which is AI, which has essentially polarized the world in terms of how scared or excited we might feel about it. In the case of creativity, though, when I'm asked to speak about the influence of AI, very often what I see is that people tend to, let's say, confuse product and process. It might look like the thing is coming up with a poem that looks very similar to what a human might do, and you know, it could be. I mean, I think of artificial creativity as something very distinct and not something to see in the same way as human creativity, but very distinct and interesting on its own. But we have to be careful to not confuse process with a product. So we, as a species, have a pretty analog kind of brain. We've evolved ways to do, to be, and that is what evolved our capacity for creativity. Any automated system has been designed for a very specific purpose. So we might come to the same outcome, here, boiling water, but you cannot compare a campfire-made water, campfire use of boiling water to a kettle. It's completely different, yeah? And the process is what matters for us. The doing is what matters for our brains. We know a lot about how pushing ourselves, skill development, is kind of autotelic, it's kind of self-rewarding if we do things that meet, we are in situations where the challenge meets our abilities, we evolve, we're very productive, and we keep enhancing who we are. If we stop using our skills, the question is how it affects not only our skill development, but our ability to engage in the most productive state of imagination and consciousness, which is the flow state. It involves doing, it doesn't come any other way. And if we don't use our brains, the old adage of neuroscience always holds, neuroplasticity is all about learning and doing, and if you don't use it, you will lose it. And we know this from decades of brain research. So that's the next thing that I want everyone to have on their radar. When we think about how to engage the creative brain, active engagement in creative practices, in abductive reasoning, is the key to really realizing your potential, our students' potential, and pushing that in a very intentional manner and thinking about the kind of tools we use to automate, to think about what that very intentionally is really important. Because without them doing it, they cannot be a creative person. Yeah? The next thing I want to get into is this definition, which is the standard definition of creativity. Things are creative if they are considered to be novel or, let's say, useful. Other words can be used for it, all interchangeable. And this definition is applied across, across types of magnitude, whether you're looking at mini C or big C creativity, lower levels of creativity, subjective levels of creativity that children show, all the way to, let's say, recognized, accepted, eminence, genius forms of creativity. But there are lots of problems with the standard definition of creativity that have been pointed out by artists, yeah? And let's take Siri Husband, who is a very good writer, and she engaged with a lot of neuroscientists, and she pointed out that for artists, this usefulness component doesn't make sense. I read out directly from what she says. I ask you whether Emily Dickinson's poems are useful. My novels, are they useful? And what use would they be? She calls this a corporate definition. Anthony Brandt, an acclaimed composer at Rice University, points to other problems with the definition, that this usefulness is very externally dependent. And so if it's dependent on other people's judgment, this is a very precarious thing because judgments can change, no two people may agree, and what the artist is doing is somehow separate from the judgment of the external person, and that needs to be there as well. So he essentially thought of things like value, utility, and so on as secondary attributes to novelty. And he also made clear that we need to distinguish the making from the reception, the process from the product, always when we think about creativity. I go back to when Husband was asked, how do you know that it's like, this might be a novel way, how do you know that it's creative? And she said, the only way an artist knows what's right and what's wrong is through a gut feeling. You look at the sentence and you say, that's it, yeah? So it starts from something within, and I've tried to pull this in my attempt at coming up with a new definition, which is to say, maybe we've latched onto the wrong end of that definition. Maybe we should be thinking about things that are novel or unexpected and satisfying, and that's perhaps where we should be starting with when we think about our creativity and those of our students, yeah? In fact, in the original standard definition, they point out the need to distinguish between the creative experience and the creative product, the internal frame of reference of the creator, the explorer, and the maker, compared to the external frame of reference of the audience, the teacher, the assessor, the field, yeah? They're not unrelated, but they are separable, and they're not substitutable for each other. So when we think about how many people agree that this is creative, we are making external, we're adopting an external frame of reference. But when we're talking about whether a person is being creative, we have to try and tap into their internal frame of reference. In that case, a child is not that different from an expert, because if they're coming up with things that are novel and satisfying to them, they are experiencing creativity. Okay? So which brings me to so I would say that this is a third thing to keep in mind, which is that we have to think about where an idea begins and where it ends, and be really cognizant of the whole process involved there. And then we know how to perhaps, stimulate creativity better in our students and our colleagues and our teams. The last thing I want to point out, again, this internal perspective is things that I think that even the most eminent think about. So take the example of Bob Dylan, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature not so long ago, and he was asked to reflect on why a musician, or he wasn't asked to, in his speech, he reflected on why a musician was getting a literature prize. And most people would think it was about the words, the meaning making, and he actually went beyond that, because he said, well, it's really about connection, it's about feeling. It is about creating something that moves people, and that all writers do this. It's about using words to move the listener. And the moving starts with yourself. If you are not moved by what you have made, there is little chance that you are moving other people. The first estimation comes with the experiencing person. Yeah? I will read this out a little bit, the words of the wonderful Carl Rogers. Perhaps the most fundamental condition of creativity is that the source or locus of evaluative judgment is internal. The value of the product is for the creative person established not by the praise and criticism of others, but by himself. And I think all of us have been in situations where students come up to us and say, is this what you want? Which means they've not really recognized that they have an internal perspective that we value. And do we value it? If we don't, we should start to. So this starts by themselves. Have I created something that's satisfying to me? Does it express a part of me, my feeling, my thought, my pain, my ecstasy? This does not mean he's oblivious to or unwilling to be aware of the judgments of others, but that it's secondary. If to the person it has the feel of being me in action, of being an actualization of potentialities in himself, which heretofore have not existed, then it is creative, it's satisfying, it's emergent. And that's what we need to try and nurture, because our students live in a time where they are entrenched in external judgment. Yeah, we are very lucky being of the older generation, because we had moments to ourselves when we could come up with our own ideas, have thoughts that we could completely develop without having to think about what everybody else thought about it. And they are not like that. They're absolutely immersed in their social sphere. It has advantages, but it has a lot of disadvantages. They're very hard on themselves. They're very, very, let's say, fragile in many ways. And it takes a lot more to be confident, to be risk-taking in that context. Yeah? We know from a lot of work on distributed reasoning that talking to people like yourself, or only being in your echo chamber of people who are like-minded, is like having a conversation with one person. Talking to people who are very, very different from each other capitalizes not only individual potential, but makes creative collaboration, creative communities a lot more powerful, because you're using the individual potential of everyone, which is unique. Yeah? So the last thing I will stop with here is to think, when we evaluate our students, to think about what are we evaluating them based on our own yardstick of our expectations, based on how they're performing relative to their peers, or based on how they performed relative to themselves, to how their previous performance 2 weeks ago, let's say. All of these, I'm not saying that they're not all important, they all are, but I think we tend to look at, in a lopsided way. We tend to ignore them in terms of their own trajectory. So I would say embrace the I, encourage our students to embrace the I as the last learning objective that I will push through, because that's the seat of it. They have to develop, that's where you start with the confidence, your ability to get a sense of, this is really new, what I'm experiencing, this is satisfying, this will perhaps resonate with a wider collective. And it has to come from within, because that's what creativity is, about our individual potential. With that, I come to the end of this impulse. I thank you so much for listening.